This is the story about a dictator who's been in big politics for more than 20 years. Under his rule, the national currency exchange rate collapsed several times over, prices have skyrocketed, and hyperinflation looms on the horizon. At the same time, he calls the central bank key rate the mother of all evils. He is guided not by the laws of economics, but by Islam, and he fires the key officials who dare to argue with the autocrat. Meet a friend and an enemy of all Russians at the same time, Mr. Recep Tayyip Erdogan. This story is about his vivid experiment, in the course of which mankind will dub him either the madman or the genius. On the screen you see the exchange rate of the dollar against the lira. That is, the higher, the worse it is for the lira. In general, it has always fallen throughout its history, but it is always a question of pace. After all, it took about 8 years for $1 to gain 6 lira more in weight. But since 2021, the exchange rate was not declining sluggishly but was falling as if jumping off a cliff. Thus, in 10 years, the currency has fallen in value more than 10 times. We are now talking about a country where, along with a wild devaluation of the currency, there is an equally wild rise in prices. Annual inflation is close to 80%. And despite this, the president is not going to raise the key rate of the central bank. Moreover, he is actively fighting all those who follow classical methods of economic management. Comrade Erdogan has his own way of doing things. In order to create the complete picture in your head, let's take a step aside and see what kind of development model this sunny country has chosen. For many folks, Turkey is associated with kebabs, riding the camels, and endless deserts. But in fact, in the world economy, this country is, well, not the first, of course, but it is notable to say the least. Its exports are highly diverse. Turkey supplies the world with textiles, reactors, automotive parts, steel, food, and plastic. In total, they sell $177 billion worth of goods overseas. You could compare that to, well, Russia. Yes, Russia sells twice as much, but the population is also twice as many, and most importantly, 72% of foreign sales are all that we pump out of the earth. Turkey, though, was deprived of land wealth, and the only option for development in such unfair conditions was to engage in business. But where would the money come from if not from the subsoil? There are 3 models of national economic growth. The economy is not a hare. It does not grow by itself. For economic growth to take place, it must be fueled with investments, and these investments have to come from somewhere. In general, we can distinguish exactly 3 options from where to take resources for these very investments. The first option is to take it from the population. You can take people's savings and turn them into investments. In order to do this, though, several conditions must be met. First, the population must have these savings and in sufficient quantities. Second, there must be tools and mechanisms for this conversion, a developed stock market, institutions that make it easy to start and run a small business. In the Turkey of the 2000s, there was no such conditions. It was hard to call the population rich, and the savings rate, that is, the share of savings in total disposable income, was historically very low. A developed stock market and institutions were nowhere to be found. All in all, it was not an option. The second option is to find resources through government spending. This is, by the way, the model of growth used in Russia and many other countries of resource state capitalism. This option is often criticized, and for good reason, but it really can work when there are effective mechanisms for redistributing resource superprofits into economic growth. It is not an option for Turkey either, as we remember it was deprived of natural resources. Since the first and second models of growth are not suitable, they have chosen the third way, with someone else's money. That is, with foreign investments. Over the past 15 to 20 years, Turkey has achieved great success in this field. What we have: cheap labor, favorable geography, and an understandable at that time monetary policy. A variety of tax incentives to attract foreign capital, a striking example the abolition of personal income tax for employees of some foreign companies, and voila, money started flowing into the country. Big money. If all the time before the 2000s the foreign infusion did not reach $1 billion, in the next 20 years it was billions of dollars. But this approach has two disadvantages. The first problem was that a trade deficit was forming, and we are not so much talking about the ratios of imports and exports of goods and services, but about the country's debt to other countries, simply put, the external debt you very well know of. As you understand, foreign investments are made in order to get them back later and then get some on top of them for all the fuss. You remember the graph of investment growth, but they also contributed to an increase in external debt, which also quadrupled since the 2000s. Well, to put it super simply, the reptiloids came, gave their dollars to Turkey, Turkey took the dollars, exchanged them for lira, built factories, started the economic movement. Then every year, Turkey pays back that investment, sells the lira, gives back the dollars. This all hits the national currency. It is starting to become cheaper, which has been happening in Turkey for many years. As a result, the economy suffers from the inaccessibility of imports. Production suffers because it is expensive to buy equipment and imported raw materials, and Turkey, as we remember, has no resources of its own. The population suffers from the high cost of imported consumer goods, which forces an increase in consumption, further eating into already scarce savings. The second problem with this model is that the model of growth based on foreign investment may work well in stable periods, but in crises it fails, because foreign investors at such times withdraw their capital out of harm's way.
Fuck this.
Look for yourself. Investment has declined here because of the US mortgage crisis. There was an attempted coup d'etat in Turkey, and then comes Monsieur Covid. A chain of these events began to shake the economy. The first time double-digit inflation occurred in 2008, but then a period of calm began. Things have changed now, though. The 80% inflation boom of today started in 2017, and then it was only about 11%. Well, our parents were right, weren't they, when they said, "Today you start smoking, and tomorrow you'll die of an overdose." Turkey had plenty of time to use the classic technique of raising the key rate, but Erdogan prevented this. He decided that in fact all the economists in the world are dead wrong, and in fact it is necessary not to raise the rate, but on the contrary, to lower it.
My belief is interest rates are the mother and father of all evil.
The economy of any country is constantly thrown into recession, then into prosperity, then into inflation, then into deflation. And throughout its history, humanity has devised tools to keep the economy in the golden mean, without falling over to the edges. One of these tools is the key rate. We talked about it in one of the previous videos. To keep it simple, business activity slows down, lower the key rate. Loans become cheaper, money is flowing, businesses flourish. Prices have gone up like crazy. Raise the key rate. Loans get more expensive. Deposits siphon off money. The money supply is shrinking. So does the activity. So do the prices. A textbook case, isn't it? In reality, there are always nuances, and such a tool as raising the key rate can be used in conditions not described in the textbooks. Take Russia's recent history. In 2014, we used the key rate hike up to 17% to stop the flow of people who wanted to buy dollars and increase the attractiveness of ruble deposits. February the 28th, 2022, similar story. The rate was raised to 20%, although this was only one way of cooling the desire to discard the ruble. There were also a lot of restrictions, commissions, a sharp drop in imports, the sale of foreign exchange surplus income. Nevertheless, though, you can also take the United States. There is a recession going on there right now, so activity is not great. But at the same time, inflation is on the rise. But it is because of rising energy prices, and yet they decide to raise the Fed rate, even though business is already depressed. They do so reluctantly because it always carries reputational risks, and they want to hold on to their position in the next term. No one wants to take on the problems of past leaders. In the beginning, they didn't perceive inflation at all. They were afraid to even say the word. This is a kind of he who must not be named. Nevertheless, the rate has been raised since the COVID time, and it looks like they will raise it again.
While higher interest rates will bring down inflation, they will also bring some pain to households and businesses. But a failure to restore price stability would mean far greater pain.
And it is now you see small rates of 2 to 3% in the US, but once in 1980, they raised the rate to as much as 20%. 7 years before that, Nixon had eliminated the convertibility of dollars to gold, which caused a spike in inflation. Well, if you can call it a spike, it was nothing compared to Turkey, but nevertheless, inflation at 13.5% forced the rate up and the economy to slow down and adapt to the new conditions. That is, usually the rate is raised to combat rising prices and protect the currency. But Recep Erdogan has his own author's take on it. It's like the classic one, only in reverse.
We are lowering and will lower interest rates to single digits in the shortest period. After it falls to single digits, inflation will also slow to single digits.
By the way, after these words, the key rate was lowered by 4.25 percentage points, and then some more. Even inflation went down for a while, but he apparently thought it was just the fact that they lowered it, not the fact that before that, for about a year and a half, the rate was about 20%. You may have a number of questions now. Did the old geezer freeze on his position and lose his mind? Can the president influence central bank decisions? Let me tell you a funny story. On November the 7th, 2020, a new governor, Naci Ağbal, took over the central bank. He received the economy not in its best shape, to say the least. Inflation was already over 10%, and even before that, $130 billion was spent, or should I say burned, to support the lira. Well, that's when they sell dollars and buy up the lira, hoping to support the exchange rate. It didn't work out so well in the end. So after the appointment at the next session, November the 20th, the head of the central bank decided to raise the key rate by as much as 4.25 percentage points, up to 15%. A month later, he raised it to 17%. He openly declared his approach.
It is obvious that a strong monetary tightening must be implemented in order to restore the disinflation process as soon as possible, and that this will continue for a long time.
He continued to follow the classic laws of economics and made another increase to 19% on March the 19th, 2021. So what do you think happened to Naci Ağbal? No, he's alive, thank God. He was fired, literally the day after another rate hike. On March the 19th, he raised the rate to 19%, some magic of numbers. And the next day, March the 20th, the president fired him, replacing him with the convenient central bank governor who shares Erdogan's ideas on monetary policy. By the way, it was already the fourth change of heads of central banks in 3 years. As you understand, dictators like to appoint those who do not argue with them. So, for example, earlier this year, the president fired the head of the National Statistics Agency, exactly after the statistics came out that in 2021 inflation was 36% and the unemployment rate was 11%. But it's very easy to say,
"Oh, the old geezer just outstayed his term, went crazy and is leading the country into the abyss."
But we're trying to find a rational basis in his approach, and it bears a name of neo-fisherism. In economics, there is the famous Fisher equation, which looks like this. Nobody needs to calculate anything here. It is used to explain the nature of things. So instead of the equal symbol, it is better to put the approximate symbol. The formula sounds like this. The bank interest rate depends on the real interest rate plus the inflation rate. The only thing that may be unclear here is the real interest rate. What is that? This is the cost of loan. That is how much interest you're willing to lend money for if you imagine that there is no inflation at all. That is, if goods don't go up in price and you loaned Joe $100 for a year, how much would you want to receive, provided that you are sure that prices in a year will not change a penny? From this equation, it is clear that the key rate of the central bank must be higher than the growth of prices. Well, because inflation is only one component of the equation. And rising bank rates make credit more expensive, which means there is less demand for loans, which means the money supply is shrinking and inflation is going down. This is the classic and only true interpretation of the Fisher equation used by most banks in the world. But if you play around with this formula, it can tell you how much you actually earn in bank deposits. You know, remember when people write in the comments like, "Well, actually, deposits in the bank are eaten up by inflation, so they are for limp dicks. Real men invest in crypto. Here is my channel with signals." Look, let's suppose the central bank rate is 10%. Inflation is 8%, then your real income will be 2% for the year. If inflation is 10%, then the deposit has earned nothing, complete naught. And if inflation is 12%, then you will lose 2% of the deposit after 1 year. This is called the Fisher effect, and it shows the purchasing value of money. Let's take an example. Joe has $1,000 and plans to buy a fridge, but not at the moment, a year from now. He puts the money in a deposit at 10%. In a year, he gets $1,100 back, but the refrigerator will also increase in price by the rate of inflation, 12%, so the price goes up to $1,120. So a year ago, Joe could buy a refrigerator, but now he needs to add another $20. Usually this is where the formula games stop, because they do not find any practical application in life. But when you're really eager... So, the neo-fisherists flip their guru's formula and say, it's not the real interest rate that shows the difference between the bank rate and inflation, but instead inflation is the difference between the bank rate and the real interest rate. And then, say the neo-fisherists, if we lower the bank rate while the real interest rate remains unchanged, inflation should slow down. If you look at the formula head-on, this is indeed the case. However, the economic community is convinced, moreover this has been proven time and again empirically, that the neo-fisherism conrads are confusing cause and effect. Why so? Because neo-fisherists can look at the equation in statics when they need to look at it in dynamics. It is in dynamics that it becomes clear that an increase in the bank rate cuts short the money supply, while a similar decrease does not have the desired effect but only accelerates inflation. There are other theories as to why neo-fisherism does not work, But the bottom line is that it really does not work all that well, so economists are unanimous in their view that neo-fisherism is a freak theory and a pseudoscience. In general, we do not know why Erdogan chose this particular interpretation, but we do know that he thinks so simply because he says so.
You know of my battle with interest rates. We are lowering interest rates, and we will lower them. Know that inflation will fall too then. It will fall more. Exchange rate will stabilize and inflation will fall. Prices will fall too. All of these are temporary.
He said this on January the 29th, 2022, when inflation was just under 50%. It confuses cause and effect. That is, it is not the real interest rate, but the key rate, well, because it is allegedly responsible for the high price increases, and that is why this approach is called neo-fisherism. In the eyes of Erdogan and his associates, it looks like this. We will defeat inflation by lowering the key rate, because the lower it is, the less inflation there is. That's what they taught us at school. The smaller the decreasing factor, the smaller the final result. But it would probably work if it was not possible to go negative, but it is. Let's go back to the Fisher effect and see what the Fisher effect in Turkey is at the moment. Let's find the real interest rate. The central bank key rate is 12%. We know that. Inflation is now 83.4%. We know that too. Then the real interest rate is negative 71.4%. So, now the most correct option is to take a loan from the bank, buy the refrigerator that Joe wanted to buy, and then sell it a year later, having received a substantial real profit of 71%. Banks in this situation lose a lot on issuing loans. I wonder if they now issue these loans in lira and at what interest rate. So, if we understand that the real interest rate is now negative 71%, then putting it into Erdogan's equation, it all adds up. I mean, even this picture should tell Erdogan that it is not necessary to lower the key rate of the central bank, it is necessary to raise the real interest rate. There is another reason we can try to explain why interest rates are the mother of all evils. The answer is religion. Usury, that is, loan sharking, is forbidden in Islam as it is, and you may know that there is such a thing as Islamic banking, which sort of adapts the precepts of the Holy Book to the realities of capitalism. Well, if you buy a fridge right away, they sell it to you for $1,000 straight. If you take it on installment plan, you end up getting it for $1,200, and the loan is kind of gone, and you don't miss out on your profits. Very convenient.
As a Muslim, I'll continue to do what is required by Islam.
What is happening now in Turkey is truly a historic moment. The president is inventing a new economy, which, by the way, has already been named Erdoganomics. His idea looks like this. Low rates provoke a boom in activity. Goods then flow into exports, currency flows into the country, thus the exchange rate rises and inflation falls. Generally, the idea is correct, but it only works with several factors running all at once. 1. Available labor. 2. Inflationary reserve. 3. Recession in the economy. In other words, when there is room to grow. So far it looks doubtful, although of course Russia and its Western counterparts have come to Turkey's aid. Well, now everything prohibited, sanctioned and improper from Western countries is being channeled through Turkey. Now exports from Turkey to Russia have increased by 50%. And the question here is this a resale of Western goods, or is Erdogan's plan working? I, on the other hand, am inclined to a different point of view. Erdogan's initial goals were short-term, when in 2021, after getting rid of the head of the central bank who disagreed with him, he started to lower key rates to reduce tensions in society and give micro-businesses cheap loans. There's a hell of a lot of small businesses, by the way. Small-medium business is 99.8% of all registered companies, thus only 0.2% is large business. More than half of the exports and almost 3/4 of the labor force work there. It worked in the short run, but closer to 2022 a collapse began to set in, leading to inflation at 80%. What is a strong autocrat to do in this situation? To retreat means to show his weakness. He's not used to admitting his mistakes. What's more, the businessman will rock the boat, to put it mildly. What is left? That's right. To invent pseudo-scientific explanations, to refer to religion, and to look for enemies to blame. Anyway, the case is extremely interesting, and it won't be long before we know whether Mr. Erdogan is an unappointed genius or an autocrat outstayed in his office. Write your thoughts in the comments for the algorithms. You know who to send this video to. And huge thanks to the big guys from the Patreon for keeping us afloat. And I'm the researcher.